Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's follow-up discussion webinar, which we're calling Feedback Loop Number 1, which is part of ASQA's strategic review of online learning in the vet sector. My name's Rob Crispe. I'm the Executive Director of Regulatory Engagement and Education at ASQA, and it's great to be back with you all after our first session before Christmas on this important piece of work for us in the sector. First up, ASQA acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and acknowledges their continuing connection to land, sea and community. We pay respects to the people, the cultures and the elders past, present and emerging. As most of you are already aware, ASQA's strategic review of online learning in the vet sector kicked off in late 2020 and is seeking to understand the opportunities and risks of online learning in the vet sector. But also to ensure that our regulatory approaches remain effective in responding to the changing environment that we are operating in. So this webinar is the second, as I mentioned earlier, in a series of webinars that we're calling feedback loops that are really important for us to gain that insight and perspective from the sector and to have a dialogue with all of you on that. It's a really important part of what we're doing with this strategic review. Today's webinar, backed by popular demand, there were a number of questions that we did have at the end of the last webinar, which we weren't able to unfortunately get to. So this has been the real driver of us coming back together today. And I'm really glad to be able to announce that we're joined today by some really key panellists in having this discussion and continuing the discussion. The first is Julie Healy. So Julie is the Director of Vocational Education and RTO Manager at TAFE Queensland and is a member of ASQA's Stakeholder Liaison Group. Welcome, Julie. We have Andrew Shea returning, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the Builders Academy of Australia. He's also a member of our Stakeholder Liaison Group and is the Chair of the Education Industry Reference Committee. Welcome back, Andrew. And of course, Judith Keller, who many of you will know from ASQA, one of ASQA's experienced principal regulatory officers who many of you have heard from in previous webinars that we've held, and Judith will bring a wealth of experience in, particularly around observing provider practice in the online learning environment. So just in terms of housekeeping, before we get into things, there are just some basics of how the webinar will work that I wanted to just cover off quickly. For this particular webinar, all participants will have their audio muted, so you should only hear from me or the panel members talking. Today's session is going to run for about 60 minutes. We are using Slido, so in our pursuit of continuous improvement, we do want to try and bring in some of these additional tools that we can use to engage with you all. So we'll be using that today for some polling activities to firstly find out who's online and also managing some questions later on in the session. So look, we'll start with the poll now. It's actually open for you and you can start adding your answers to at any time. I'll then be asking the panel to answer those questions that we didn't cover last time. But you can see there, I think on the screen there, there's a link to Slido and you've got the event code there. So please feel free to engage with that and to provide us with some information. That would be really fantastic. We are also going to open the floor a little bit later on in the session to the audience, all of you, to ask questions to the panel. So whilst we'll have limited time for that, we are keen to hear your questions in real time this afternoon. And to submit a question, please also join our Slido event using the event code, as I mentioned, on the screen there. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to answer specific questions questions that are targeted to specific providers or specific specific situations. So please just try and keep your questions broad and relevant to the entire audience as much as possible. That would be great. We will aim to group questions into themes so that we can cover as many as possible, and we'll be collating those live as they come through in the background. Those of you who use Slido regularly will know that you can add your vote to questions that have already been submitted, so please feel free to do that as well. And just two final notes on this. There'll be a survey after the webinar, as we have done in previous webinars, where you'll have the opportunity to let us know what you think, and of course to submit any further suggestions for future topics and questions, etc. Also to let you know that this presentation is also being recorded, so in the coming days we'll upload it to the ASQA website, and I'd encourage you to send the link that we'll issue to you out to your extended networks as well, so that people can have a look who might not have been able to make it today. That would be great. And just before we get into the Slido poll results, I did want to mention that we are waiting for some new branded banners to arrive. So you might note that I don't have banners behind me, which was not part of the plan for today, but to let you know that they are coming. And so hopefully by the next session, we will have some professional branding behind me for these sessions. So just wanted to mention that. In terms of the Slido poll, I'm not sure if we've got data up yet, team, on what that is looking like. So it looks like about 60% of our audience today are from private providers. There's about 17% from TAFE, 7% from enterprise RTOs. So look, obviously a strong representation from the private sector, private portion of the sector, and also TAFEs, but it's great to see really a cross section there. Some members from schools and community providers, which is fantastic. Thank you. And my screen's cutting off there, but I can see there's some other groups represented. That's great. What type of provider are you working in? So thank you everybody for engaging with that. Senior management, 50%, that's great. Thanks for making the time. Compliance manager, trainer and assessor, student enrolment. Again, a great turnout, which really does, I think, reflect how broad and deep this particular topic stretches through the sector. Fantastic. Now that data might continue to pop up there. If it's all right with everybody, I'm just going to keep moving insofar as trying to background our next part of the session. But please do have a look at that data as it's popping up there, so you can see some interesting data there around the tools that are being used and the way that online learning is being applied. So whilst you're looking at that, let me start to background our next session. So we've compiled 7 key questions based on the feedback that you've provided and from the last session as well, which are going to be answered by our panel today. In terms of us trying to be as efficient as possible and get as many questions pushed through as we can in this time, we're going to try and allow a couple of minutes for each response, and our presenters are going to try and work with us on that. So it will be tight timing, but hopefully we'll be able to make some really good headway, and then we're going to have time, as I said at the end, to have some real-time questions as well. So again, whilst the data is flowing through there, and I think we're near the end of that data stream, and thank you all for participating with that. I will ask Julie to speak to our first question. Julie Healy, thank you for stepping up today, and it's just a reminder to everybody that I will need to be a little bit militant about timings as we're trying to be ultra efficient today. So we're going to try and do each question in a couple of minutes if we can. But Julie, the first question goes to you, and that is, can online classes replace face-to-face delivery? Over to you, Julie.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And in short, I'd say in some situations, yes, but highly dependent on the industry area and the training package requirements. The more theoretical-based training products like BSB, ICT, Justice, CUA, etc., do lend themselves to a more online learning methodology as opposed to the highly practical based areas like trades, health, community services. And similarly, within a qualification, some units may lend themselves or be more suitable than others. I think, important to point out is online classes are appropriate for the acquisition of knowledge and the initial development of practical skills. However, we do need to acknowledge that students do need an opportunity to practice and apply their knowledge and skills in a variety of different contexts prior to being assessed. So in many situations, as long as the online classes are used in conjunction with other learning opportunities, then outcomes can be achieved. So it's highly dependent then on that overarching training and assessment strategy for the qual. And I think, there's few training packages that don't require students to either access simulated or real work environments. So it is a challenge for practical skills to be developed solely through an electronic platform. The amount of training, I think, comes into play there as well, and we've got to acknowledge that it's unreasonable to expect that a student attend a class, an online class, and then in the same session be expected to be assessed. So I think, again, that comes down to the training and assessment strategy. Need to qualify what we mean by online delivery and the concept, linkage to direct versus indirect instruction. If we assume that it is that direct instruction from a trainer, then your system, the platform itself, can, I guess, constrain or become a bit of a barrier. And similarly, how the learning is being designed or constructed. What's often lost from a direct face-to-face situation is that ability for students to ask questions, or maybe it's not the ability, maybe it's their confidence to ask the question in an online environment, especially with large numbers, getting the additional support that often is provided, and for teachers to provide feedback at the time of learning. And they're all really important aspects that do contribute towards student success. In saying that, there's some great benefits to online classes. We can cater for bigger numbers. We can utilise multiple trainers to address some of those barriers I pointed out. And more importantly is that ability to record the session, and that can be extremely useful for cohorts where you've got students that do need more time to absorb the knowledge, to grasp the concept, so they can go back and replay and work through more at their own pace. Principles of fairness, consistency need to be considered. We can't disadvantage students, so if they don't have a suitable device or access to Wi-Fi internet, it does become a bit of a barrier and unfair. And then lastly, I think student preference, and there's been, interestingly, a lot of research since COVID that looked into that transition to this more remote learning, and students often, their preference is face-to-face. So again, that just highlights that combination approach may be the better, strategy as opposed to totally online.
Thanks, Julie. That's great. Well, flowing on from that, in terms of question 2, I might invite Andrew to take this question. Andrew, what constitutes appropriate online delivery? For example, is there a requirement to deliver live online classes, or are recorded classes acceptable?
Thanks, Rob. I'll start by saying, I guess, the integrity of and the success of our sector and the reputation, and one that I'm really proud to be part of, is based on a competency-based system that raises questions about the suitability of online learning in certain groups and for certain cohorts and across certain training packages. So I guess I'll start by saying the questions that need to be answered within your organisation is, who are you moving forward? So not what you had to rapidly do during COVID, because there is a component of that, and making sure that that's tied up, students have been supported, and that for a compliance framework as well, you've done everything you can do for a positive experience. But you need to ask yourself, are you a bricks or clicks organisation? What is the actual mode that's best for your organisation, that meets your own internal capabilities, or those that you can actually quickly develop, and those that your students want to buy? Because at the end of the day, our customers judge with their feet if we can't give a good product. So we need to be genuine in what we can actually deliver. And that comes down to the question of synchronous versus asynchronous. So basically, in Sync Live, or asynchronous has pre-developed what we'd typically call self-paced type learning. So if we have a look at some of the data, right? And I have to bring up the data from this, because there's a lot of views on online learning. There's a lot of views of what is most suitable for different student cohorts. Really importantly, it's key to understand that the last data released by NCVER says only 8.6% of providers had their primary delivery mode as online. Now, from the data we saw earlier in the surveys, that's probably somewhere in the 90% over the last 12 months. So I guess the consideration for today that I'm referencing is not necessarily what did you have to do, but what do you want to do moving forward, and what can you do well? If we look at the NCVER report, and I've noted it there just on the screen for those who want to actually review this, some really interesting outcomes. What it shows is that completion rates across the board on average are at least 10% lower via an online delivery mode versus face-to-face. In some areas, such as a diploma of IT, they're 40% lower, and completion rates are actually close to 10%. So that's staggering when I read that and thought, I would have thought that introverted IT professionals may be suitable, but it's really centralised to the point that you need to look at your own student cohort The other side that was interesting in this report is that teacher delivery and the actual training itself was far below from a student satisfaction rate when completed online. And I think largely that is because the query that people haven't actually, or the solution haven't been able to solve is, what do we want to actually try and achieve? And the data tells us that students like the engagement of a classroom. So how do we ensure that the negatives that can come with online learning, such as the feeling that they are on their own, they don't have live access to a teacher, they don't have that camaraderie of having the peer pressure of getting to class and saying, how are you going with your assessments? Let's throw around these ideas, including the networks that they actually can create and the relationships they create through that educational experience. And that's as valuable sometimes as the knowledge. I know, teaching myself, one of my first statements in a new class is, you will learn as much from each other as you will from me. You already have most of the answers within you due to your experience. And our jobs as teachers, trainers, facilitators is to draw that knowledge out. So keeping that central and saying, how can that be translated to an online environment is key. A couple of quick points on how to address those weaknesses. So lack of face-to-face with the teacher. I'll always go towards a live virtual classroom, remote real-time learning centralized model is what I believe is the most suitable online, with supplementary support materials through an ability to have pre-recorded videos and using the resource you already have within your organisation. The lack of camaraderie means you need to engage. Students need to have their cameras online, do breakout rooms, and if someone was in a physical classroom and they're back to you as a teacher, you'd throw the first question at them. Same thing online. From technical support, our organisation, we have 24-hour IT support that we outsource to a third-party company, that if they can't get their laptop going and they go, gee, I've just wasted a couple of hours I wanted to study, what support can you give them? We have a third-party report that can VPN in and fix their computer issues. The other side is, how do you measure success? So having study coaches and knowing the metrics of how a student is progressing when online is key. Because as soon as you see them struggling, you can jump in and say, let's book in a face-to-face meeting, let's book in a Zoom meeting or go-to meeting, whatever the platform is being used, and how do we measure the success of the actual experience the students are having. And the best way we've found this as a final point is, and it's a shame we can't have video in this presentation, but this just gives you a little bit of a snapshot of something we did in our organisation where we filmed the live builds of a large number of homes from an external perspective. We then also created a virtual walkthrough that students can walk through on the computer screen, click the button, and the build will come up and tell them about the different materials being used and the different techniques that are important. If the student wishes to, they can also order a Google Cardboard headset. On eBay this morning, I saw them selling for $3.49. If they really want to go to the next level, you can go to sort of the Oculus headsets, that we have rooms set up for that. My key message of this is that it's not as expensive to do as you think. We do this, the system to take the footage of the 3D walkthrough, stitch it together, we've spent less than $2,000. And people would be astonished by that, but that's the movement of technology at the moment. And the fact that Facebook bought the company that does these headsets suggests it's going to be something we see a lot more in our education moving forward.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to hear about some of those innovations in your space. Certainly some food for thought for our audience today. So next question, I'm going to invite Judith now. Judith, do RTOs need to record online classes to be compliant, and how long must these records be retained?
I'm going to answer the question from two perspectives, some of which both Julie and Andrew have touched on. And that relates to the benefits for students of recording classes. And I think, Julie, you spoke about the benefits of where a class is recorded and students can then access that recording as a resource later on that they can review. And similarly, Andrew, you've just mentioned the same as well in terms of something that might be recorded and then accessed by students later on. I think with respect to recording the classes, there's no need to record them per se, or no requirement to record them. However, an important consideration is assessment. So if, for example, you've conducted assessment as part of your class, the recording or a recording may become part of the assessment evidence that is used as a basis for making determinations about whether or not a student is competent. in which case the recordings would need to be retained usually for up to 6 months, as a minimum of 6 months, so that you do have that evidence to support the competency decisions. I just also want to touch on the other aspect of recording, because with respect to the question, I think the question might almost be about student attendance as well, and the records that need to be in place around students. In the online environment, there are many different ways, of course, that attendance can be captured and recorded. And for providers that are actually required to record and monitor student attendance as a condition of their registration on CRICOS, having that record and implementing the policy and the procedure for, first of all, recording the attendance and monitoring the attendance is essential. Of course, records of the students' participation in online activities might be captured through the recording, which can also be helpful in terms of assisting to identify student needs, looking at students' progress and the extent of their engagement. So to that extent, a record of that attendance, as distinct from a recording of the actual online class itself, is important. And it might be particularly important, as I've mentioned, for international students, where providers are required to provide up to 20, are required to provide as a minimum 20 scheduled course contact hours per week. So the recording of the class can actually provide evidence of that having been provided. We do, of course, recognise that during COVID, the situation has been different around the attendance requirements. And I just probably want to return to the case that we spoke about before, about whether or not online classes could replace face-to-face delivery. In many instances, yes, they can. However, for CRICOS students, we do need to have consent for the switch from face-to-face to online. And in some instances, it may not necessarily be appropriate for the student or suitable for the student. And I'm thinking of a recent example where I've visited a provider and the students were ALICOS students. And in that particular instance, for many of the students, navigating the online environment was quite difficult, and in that particular instance, a class, whether it was replaced through online or even recorded online, was not appropriate or necessarily going to meet the needs of the students.
Thank you, Judith. Definitely food for thought there as well. And following on from that, the question number 4 is directed to Julie. Julie, how can RTOs ensure that the online assessment of practical skills is compliant?
Yeah, look, Rob, obviously it's highly dependent on the actual training package and the specifications outlined in the assessment requirements. So, it's important that, that they're well understood. The hierarchy of evidence needs to be considered. So whether the planning of that assessment is going to be sort of direct evidence versus indirect or supplementary. We can be caught in that trap where either insufficient evidence is captured or the opposite, where there's a tendency to increase the number of tasks to, try to cover off that there's some, because there is indirect evidence being used or supplementary, that how do we then confirm that, that was actual. Sometimes that conversion of direct to indirect can create more work and load on the assessor themselves. Authenticity is a key consideration. So, do need to verify the student's identity in some way, shape or form and confirm that it's their own work. That, is achievable, and we've seen some great examples of that. I talked about the training package itself, and in particular there, that if we're going to opt for, if the training package permits and you can go for a simulated environment, is, how do we assimilate that environment? It should be as close as possible. So there's a lot of prescription that needs to go into that in detail that perhaps, is more than what traditionally may be seen. So, especially if you're going to be doing things like role plays. So, how do we get consistency. What is the direction given to each of those players within that role play? And again, that's a lot of upfront work that may need to happen to ensure the consistency, to ensure that good direction so that we are going to get valid outcomes. So, it is possible. We've just got to do a lot more planning, a lot more consideration and thought, and perhaps, a little bit more prescriptive detail. I think another point is just what is typically the assessor's role in practical assessment. Often the assessor is the one that provides that very clear instruction up front. So if the assessor's it's not a direct assessment, who's going to provide that clear instruction? The assessor often is the one that provides or asks supplementary questions at the time. So, is that going to be an extra? At what time? How's that going to be captured, recorded for future? Contingency. So often, the dimensions of competency, we do look at the contingency options, and so therefore, how will we do that? So once again, just pointing out the thought and the design, thinking through what's to be captured as part of this practical. And then safety is, assessor does take that role on of assuring safety as part of that practical assessment. If the expectation is the student has gone and has to access a workplace, obtain all the access to the different workplace processes, systems, etc., who's responsible for ensuring their safety as they capture this video, perhaps, and upload it? Which leads to that, concept of student perspective is think about their assessment load and practicality. There is a lot of extra work with them negotiating perhaps the workplace, the access. They've got to have the video or other capabilities, and potentially clients. So that needs, a little bit more time, and they do need I don't know, it depends on the platform, I suppose, but the time to upload that video recording, that takes a lot. And there's, from the, looking at it from the other side, from the teacher perspective, there's the platform itself can be restrictive in how much can be stored. And then the assessor, and how much time that takes them to watch each of these video recordings, to then complete your checklists and so on, and then store that checklist as part of the assessment record. So there's a few complexities there.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, no, some great insights, absolutely. I appreciate you sharing those. For question 5, very moving along, Andrew, I'm going to throw to you on this one, and it's really a question around how your RTO monitors attendance. So really interested to sort of hear from you on that question. Over to you.
Thanks, Rob. So we actually work with a program that has a student management system integration. It happens to be called RTO Plus. It's one that we helped as an initial developer years ago to give insight. The key to the system, and I'll put it up full screen to be easy to see. So every time one of our students want to access one of our virtual classes, they have to go in via the learning management system where it shows they understand where all the content is and there's a level of engagement, shows they still have their password. They then have to click on an attendance portal and physically sign that they are in the class. Now, this does a couple of things. One, the API integration, meaning that it pushes data into your student management system as your source of truth, your main IT system that reports NCVER data and potentially funding data, etc. It will actually open units of competency if you want to after a QA check. It will actually monitor attendance of the student. The way we have actually configured this, which works really successfully, is if the student misses a class, it sends them an email and says, sorry to see you missed the class yesterday. Would love to hear from you if there's anything we can do to help you get back into class. If they miss 2 classes, it sends them an SMS and says, really sorry to say you missed. Here, click here to book in a link via Calendly to speak to one of our team about how we can support you. They miss a 3rd one and a 4th one, and we're calling them proactively. And at any stage, we can have an active at-risk student list. So we know who needs support, who's falling behind, who may have faced barriers, and it starts with that attendance. Now, it doesn't mean the student has to market themselves. Obviously, a trainer could market on their behalf. But a system like this ensures that the other parameters are being met at the same time, from the student accessing the system, from the student being able to understand the content to be delivered on that day, to sign terms and conditions about where they're located, if that's something for funding contracts it's important, to have any specific notes for them where they say there might be some money outstanding, whatever it may be. It's a way of ensuring that quality check, and having the digital signature is just that extra quality assurance measure that works really well for us.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great. Now, in terms of the next question, I'll invite Judith back to just give us a few insights on international students. So the question is, regarding international students, can RTOs deliver more than 25% of course content online in the post-COVID world while remaining compliant with the ESOS Act? And will the ESOS Act be amended? So Judith, over to you. And conscious that there's a few elements to that question, but if we're able to get through that in a few minutes, that'd be great.
Certainly. So for those of you who are CRICOS registered providers, you will certainly be well aware that as providers under the National Code, under usual circumstances, you would not be permitted to deliver more than 1/3 of units or the equivalent of a VET course online or by distance learning to an overseas student. And of course, you wouldn't normally expect a course to be delivered fully online. However, we have been in a rather unusual world for the last 12 plus months. And of course, many ASQA regulated providers during COVID-19 have used distant delivery or online modes for training and assessment. And as both Julie and Andrew have mentioned, that's been provided that, of course, the training package requirements have allowed that to occur. The allowance, of course, for full online delivery was extended to CRICOS registered providers, including those delivering both VET and ALACOS courses. And ASQA is an ESOS agency under the ESOS Act. However, the Department of Education, Skills and Employment is responsible for administering the Act, and CRICOS and PRISMs. And they have effectively been the policymakers in this space. So going forward, I imagine that there are significant learnings that we have from the time that we've had during the last 12 months, and keeping in mind that we're not in the post-COVID world as yet. One of the key requirements obviously has been, as part of that process, is to document any changes that you've had to your training and assessment strategies and the reasons for that during this time. With respect to future developments in this area, I encourage you to keep up to date with the information that is on the Department of Education, Skills and Employment website in relation to the delivery of students during the COVID period, and obviously any changes that occur with respect to the delivery would be noted there, and similarly through communications from ASQA as well.
Thanks, Judith. That's great. And Andrew, last but certainly not least, picking up on the innovation theme that you brought forward earlier, what are some of the hallmarks of an appropriate learning management system for RTOs to use to deliver courses online? And did you have any examples that you might be able to talk about today?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I'm keen not to spruik certain systems because, but I can speak to the functionality that's been important to us who have a review every 12 months to see suitability. The first thing I would say is make sure someone has the role within your organisation to review the systems you have in place, to review what's out there, and almost why not have innovation in their title, right? IT systems innovation. Unless you charge someone with that role, you're not going to know what best practice is out there, and you may just get caught up in a sales pitch from different organisations, and there's some good sales pitches out there. The things that I've found that are most important is, first of all, decide what's going to be the master and what's going to be the slave. Are you going to collect all your evidence in a learning management system and then simply put the result in your student management system? Are you using a combined system that can do both? Is there government funding requirements? These are the questions you need to ask when looking at a learning management system. The API integration between the systems you already have is so important, so you're not just duplicating the same data from system to system to system. If they tell you it has an API integration, say, great, who are 3 RTOs like me I can speak to so I can actually see the bona fides of the system and ask tough questions to them about how it's really worked. It needs to be mobile friendly, app friendly. Everyone, especially younger generations now, everything's on their phones, smartphones. They want to do their study, they want to watch their videos. We have LinkedIn learning videos linked to some of our content 70% of our content's being watched on a mobile phone, not actually on the desktop, when from a self-paced perspective, so the importance of having an app and being mobile friendly. Developing content, don't do it organically in the system, make it a SCORM compliant, meaning you can unscramble the egg if you need to, and move towards systems. And most importantly, is having functionality to track your student success. This is just a system, we do use Canvas, I'll put that out there because I'm showing a screenshot of it. They have a system called Dropout Detective. It basically identifies which students are at risk due to a lack of activity. When was the last time they logged in? How many sessions did they watch? How long were they on the learning content? How many assessments did they submit? Second to that, what assessments are sitting in there ready to be graded by the assessor? The key to a lot of this too is having a trigger for when they need support. So our LMS, we set up with some of this functionality to know exactly the progress of the students, as well as the RTO Plus system from attendance I talked about earlier. And at any point of time, the student says, gee, you know what, I need some support here. There's a number of things they can do. They can actually reach out and click a button to get live support. They can go on and actually watch a image such as this one, where it may be, let's have a look at an assessor talking through the question you might have. So a frequently asked question repository. But best of all, when can they talk to a real person? Because no matter how you do inline learning, how much of it you do from an asynchronous perspective, the human component can't be missed. And the at-risk student who needs support aspect needs to be at the click of the button so that they can make sure they come to you, and then their success is your success. And completion rates are one indicator of success, not the only one, but one indicator. And as they progress, you want to be able to catch them if they do become disengaged. The learning management system and the attendance systems can be great systems and portals to allow that to occur.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And again, some really important insights in how we might make this work with technology. So thanks very much for sharing that with us. All right, colleagues, we are now moving into the next part of the session today in terms of picking up on some of your live questions. So thank you firstly to our panel members for that great segment of discussions. Really appreciate all of your insights. We're now going to take a bit of a look at some of the questions, and I've got a couple off the boil here. The first question that I might pose to Julie is, my apologies, Judith, is in terms of work placement. Judith, obviously this is an important issue for the sector at the moment in terms of COVID and the like. The question is, in terms of work placement, can we use simulations to replace actual workplace visits whenever possible?
You can use simulation to replace our workplace where the training package allows it. And ASQA has recently put some videos, I think, onto our website, some education videos around when you may use simulation and when you must use workplace. And often that's actually specified in the assessment conditions for a unit of competency.
Great, thanks, Judith. Our next question is around authenticity, and I think, Julie, you touched on this earlier in terms of so the question is, how do you ensure authenticity when conducting online assessment?
Yeah, look, I think it depends on the type of assessment you're referring to. So, if you're doing written or online quizzes, etc., there is a number of different invigilation type of, programs you can use that can embed within. If you're looking at more the practical skills, the uploading of the videos, etc., they just have to be able to, swivel their camera to show that that is in fact them that is conducting or presenting that work. So there are some simple, it doesn't have to be expensive. There are some simple measures there, but the important thing is, you need to be confident as the assessor that that is the student's work or that is the student themselves. It's holding up an ID, their driver's license next to their face to show that I am this student is as simple as it might get. Yeah,
great. Thanks, Julie. Our third question is, and you can see up on the Slido board there, we're getting lots of questions. The third one is, what would you consider best practice for an online assessment? And I'm going to ask Andrew this question.
Sure, thanks, Rob. So I think when we talk about best practice, it's first important to acknowledge that not all assessments can be conducted online. For a practical trades assessment, whether it be cookery, whether it be building, whether it be hairdressing, I don't have the problem anymore, but I wouldn't want to go to a hairdresser a few years ago. who had only learnt online how to cut hair. So there are some things that can't be simulated. The training packages are trying to call that out. And look, I think the training package development process is particularly, broken's a strong word, but I can't think of anything else at the moment. I don't think it's representative of the trust that the training provider should have. And I think we have a fantastic range of training providers in the sector that are under-respected, in my view, from a number of parties. Now, I think the training package overreach is trying to capture some of the very small number of bad providers who may not have done the right thing, and most of them are now out of the sector. So that's not something that should impact. I guess from what can we do from those things that can be assessed online, Julie touched on a couple of them, but it has to be what is a real simulation, not a matter of, yes, it's close enough, but it's online. It's what is a real simulation. I give the example of Recruit, Select, Induct staff, which is across maybe 13 qualifications. I've done all of my interviews for the last 12 months using Zoom, and I've had to hire accordingly because we haven't been able to get face-to-face because I'm in Victoria. Have I been able to get the job done and demonstrate the same rapport building or asking questions or investigating certain areas via that forum? Well, I would argue that I could. No, I would prefer to be face-to-face to get that gut feel component, but from a demonstration of skills and outcome, I think I could. And it's really about being genuine and true to ourselves in RTOs going, is it equivalent? And it's only if it's equivalent can it be done online simulated. If something's missing, online learning can never be seen as less than. It can be more suitable for certain learner cohorts. It can be more appropriate for certain geographical areas, but it should never dilute the importance of competency-based training and the genuine work readiness of a graduate or someone who's been found competent.
Thanks, Andrew. Much appreciated. Next question for Judith is, how should RTOs meet amount of training requirements with self-paced online courses?
I'm reflecting upon the Distance Learning Compliance Essentials webinar that we presented in May last year, and I'd probably refer you also to that recording, which I believe is also on the ASQA website as well. And at that particular point in time, we talked about modifying strategies for training and assessment that are on when we're delivering online. And I think the example, and I think it was Emma who was presenting at the time, gave the example about how we might create a learner guide, for example, that we make available to students over a 12-month period. And that, in fact, doesn't necessarily mean that the student might access the learner guide. They might read it in an hour, but it doesn't actually mean that the course duration is of 12 months. The student may, in fact, need access to other additional resources to actually support their learning as part of that process. So, for example, video resources, there may be links to other resources outside of your online learning system that are provided there for the student to access. So for students accessing online learning or self-paced online learning, of course, all the students, and if we were undertaking the course ourselves, would undertake the course at a different speed, I guess. And also that should be taken into account, making sure that there is sufficient resources there for students to meet the volume of learning requirements, but also recognising too that the actual amount of training may differ as part of that process for each student, even though the same resources are made available to students. So it is, I guess, a tricky question to some extent. However, regardless of what's provided in the online environment, it must meet the students' needs. And even as I'm saying this, I'm reflecting upon students who may have particular language literacy and numeracy needs. They may in fact need a longer period of time to absorb the learning that occurs through the online learning process. They may need adapted resources as well to actually address their particular language literacy or numeracy needs. So those are all important considerations as part of that determining of both the amount of training and the overall volume of learning. Also recognising too, for some students, there may be experiences that they have outside of the online learning environment and the training environment that actually allow them to undertake the course for a shorter duration and to be able to submit evidence which would reduce the volume of learning for them as well.
Great, thank you, Judith. Next question is for Julie. and this is, how do we meet the foundational skills of two-way communication when delivering online learning?
That again will come down to how you design the interaction. So, it's important, and Andrew highlighted a number of key functions of a suitable LMS. And I'd say, one of the most important ones, if you're looking at student success, is thinking about the pedagogy and the functionality and tools that are within an LMS that do support pedagogy. So collaboration, communication, and interaction are the three big ones from my perspective. So, it is important that, you've got an LMS that does facilitate that one, and then you are designing the learning and or assessment to allow that two-way communication and recording of that two-way communication. That is such an essential component, of foundation skills and, work-ready learners.
Thank you, Julie. That's great. We've got an interesting question around video evidence. Why do you need to keep video as evidence of assessment when there's no need to take or keep video evidence when conducting assessment in a face-to-face environment? I might call on you, Judith, to help with this one.
So I will probably clarify that by saying that video evidence is one form of evidence that you may collect as part of an assessment process. There may in fact be other forms of evidence that are collected. So for example, if a student undertakes a practical assessment, it might be, for example, that they're required to produce a particular product. There might be a checklist that the assessor uses to actually record the student's performance on that particular task. What the video evidence, as I've just clarified, it's not necessarily required, but it can actually contribute to the sufficiency of the evidence, being one of the rules of evidence as part of your assessment process. So the key thing, I guess, is to look at the overall assessment and to consider, do I have sufficient evidence to actually support the competency decision? And if video evidence is available, that may be one way that you can actually support your competency decision. You've got the evidence, you can review it, you can see that the student has actually performed the task. Another aspect of video evidence that can be useful in the online environment is if, for example, you haven't been able to visit a student on site to undertake a practical task. The student may actually collect the video evidence and upload it through the learning management system so that the assessor can actually review the student performing the task in the video. So there's different ways in which the videos may be used as evidence. As I said, no requirement to necessarily retain it. However, if it is part of the evidence and does contribute to demonstrating that there was sufficient evidence and that it was valid evidence, that it was authentic evidence and current evidence, then you may wish to retain it for the period that you're required to retain student assessments for.
Hey Rob, I might just add to that because I've got a relevant example from the TAE training package and one that most in this meeting would have conducted themselves, which is group-based learning, or you would have completed as a student. From the TAE perspective, we had a look years ago and said, what does the audience need to be to show the genuine demonstration of the skill? And at the time it was decided, because there was a lot of anecdotal evidence that someone was sending a video of them presenting to their cat and going, the cat seemed to love it, so pass me. They actually put in there needed to be 8 real people in the audience. So there could be rapport building, so there could actually be engagement, they could be throwing questions at them, they could control the classroom, work with people, etc., etc. Now, we're proposing in the very short term that gets reduced to 4, just as a side note. But I think the reason for that being, to Judith's point, was the assessment conditions need to be clearly demonstrating the evidence that an RTO can show. The more detailed the actual assessment tool and the matrix that are being graded against, and the more detail on the specific skills demonstrated towards deeming satisfactory or compliant, in my experience, a video of what actually occurred isn't needed, because there is sufficient evidence to give confidence to not call out, gee, I can't see how you possibly made this work. And that's more relevant online than ever because there are certain things that are extremely difficult to do that do require supplementary evidence of third-party reports, videos from a work site, workplace logs of demonstrating the hours signed off by a supervisor, that all fill the competency bucket before a confidence can be gained that there was the rules of evidence and principles of assessments being met.
Thanks, Andrew. And look, while I've got you there, there's been a lot of questions around the name of the attendance software that you were showing us earlier. I know you wanted to be brand agnostic today, but you've been called out a little bit. So are you happy to share that?
Yeah, more than happy to. It's called RTO Plus, and what I would say is, and I'm a big fan of it. I'm going to just move on to it here. I'm a big fan of it because of the fact that you can create it what you want to put in the portal to then push through to your other system. What I would say is, and again, I use it and we are very diligent in choosing what systems we use. What I would add though is some learning management systems already have similar capability, some student management systems. The biggest challenge with all of these IT companies that produce this, in my experience, is sometimes they don't spruik their wares about all the capabilities they have. They just go with the headline. So what I would suggest is go back to the student management system you're using, go back to the learning management system and say, hey, I heard these other ones are doing this cool stuff. What have you got? And either put the pressure on them to develop it, or they might go, oh, actually, we've got something we just launched for a certain client. You might find it interesting too. This one happens to be RTO Plus. It has an API with a number of student management systems. We use VetTrack as our student management system, have for over 10 years for a range of reasons, but it's a really neat integration. And what I say to my team all the time is the more you can automate, the more you can send out messaging to students and just say, hey, we're here to support you, the more time your staff can focus on the human-centered approach, the human element of students, and generally reach out and say, hey, let's have an open chat. How can we actually help you succeed?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Andrew. Much appreciated. And look, last but not least, final question today, what systems can support online learners with their engagement? And I might direct this to Julie.
Wow. So look, there's, I think the LMS itself, and the functionality within. You've got your video conference platforms, really, really important. I think, as Andrew pointed out earlier, having that integrations. You want the student experience to be seamless. They don't want to have to be jumping out of one into another. So having it all in one is really, really important, that integration between. There are a number of different apps that are useful. There's some, in terms of polling. Some of those are built within the LMSs. Some are additional apps that you can integrate. But again, go back to those basic concepts of, collaboration, communication. And if the LMS or the video conference tool doesn't have them, think about, what are the other resources out there that can be utilised. Andrew, you might have some other suggestions or common ones that you would use, but I don't want to name any, but, there is a large number of polls. The breakout rooms I think are great. So again, some of the LMSs have the breakout rooms. I think that's really helpful, especially with large groups and managing, the various different contexts and scenarios that you do want to expose learners to.
I think, Julie, I'd just add, the andragogy for an online class is no different than a face-to-face. If you think it's different, you're not going to do it as well. These session plans need to talk about the systems you want to use. Whether you actually get people to put up their hand for a survey or use Slido, it's the intent and the creation of the session plan to get the educational and engagement outcome that is key. Set what you want to measure yourself by, set what you see as success and the outcomes you want your students to achieve, and then you'll easily be able to go and find a solution because there's so many systems out there. Go to your peak bodies, go to another RTO, cold call them and say, hey, what do you use? I'm never saying no, right? If people want to go onto YouTube, they can see me do a walkthrough of all of our virtual classroom technology, methodology, running a live class. We as a community of practice, we all want the sector to be positive, have a quality outcome, and I think we do a great job of it. And ASQA is doing a fantastic job to allow for these forums where we can actually hear from shared ideas and get questions. And I think ASQA probably should be thanked particularly for the change of approach in that, because I think it's a fantastic mode and been really well received by industry and including my organisation.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks Julie as well for your response there. Colleagues, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up the questions there. We're at almost the end of time for the webinar today. We did have one more question that did surface at the end of the last session, which is, how can I find out more about ASQA Strategic Review? And look, I promise you it was an actual question, not a loaded question. And this time round, this question very much serves as a little bit of I guess, a plug for the strategic review and some of the resources that we've already been putting out to the sector as a result of the work that we're doing in that space. And as I said at the beginning, we did launch the strategic review in December last year to really identify the challenges and information needed to better support providers in understanding and delivering the quality training in an online environment. And so today's discussion, I think you can agree, it has been very valuable in helping us work that through a little bit more. An important part of our consultation is, of course, listening to and understanding the experience of providers. And so some of that is obviously occurring through our feedback loops like today's session, but we have also recently released a survey to all registered providers, which you should have received. And so please make sure, if you haven't already, to check your email box for the survey link that was sent from our supporting partner agency, ASL Allen, who we've partnered with on the survey. It's open until Friday the 19th of March. Our next strategic review feedback loop webinar is scheduled at this stage for mid-April, so keep an eye out for that, and there'll be some announcements coming on that. That will be through all the usual ASQA channels that we use, including through your professional and representative bodies as well. And you can get more detail about the strategic review and catch up on previous webinars by visiting our website. If you go to the strategic review webpage, you'll be able to get all that information there. And also just to reiterate that a recording of today's session will be available on our website, and it'll be sent to you in the form of a link. So, and as well, I think we're also going to be trying to get some of the publications mentioned in today's session out to you too. And I think that's been requested by a couple of you in the questions this afternoon. So look, thank you very much for your engagement. We've had a wealth of questions there. We really appreciate all of your interest and engagement. Please make sure you do fill out the evaluation and give us some feedback so we can continuously improve. That's really important to us. Once again, thank you very much to our panellists again today, Julie, Judith and Andrew, for giving up your time so generously. And also we did have a strategic review recording presented at the Digital Learning Day on February 25th, 2021. So I believe you can get that online as well. If you search Digital Learning Day, there was also some content there that we presented. So thank you very much for tuning in to what I hope has been an informative discussion. As I mentioned, fill in the surveys. If we didn't get to your question today, please rest assured that we'll be looking at all of them as we did last time, and they will certainly inform some of the feedback loop activity we come back to you with as we go forward into April. And of course, we look forward to continuing to engage with you all as we progress the review into the middle of the year, which is we are at this stage hoping to finalise everything around August. And we look forward to staying with you up until that point and doing more work on this important topic. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.